Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love your will.
Greetings, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm really happy to be here to deliver this talk for the first time called In Beauty is Eternal Truth Revealed, Aesthetics and the Art of Magic. Although this is not the most, I don't know why I pointed it at the screen, the thing's over here. I'm probably going to do that a lot. Although this is not the most exciting way to begin a talk, I'm going to start by outlining some questions and generally how I want to answer those questions. There's sort of a lot of twists and turns in the presentation that I'm going to give, and so I think it helps to actually have an overview of what I'm talking about. I'm trying to understand what the relationship is between thelema and art. I think a lot of people recognize that there is some relationship between thelema and art because thelema seems to attract so many artists or people with artistic backgrounds, and thelemic ideas have been transmitted throughout the 20th century up until today via things like music and film. So there seems to be a pretty close relationship there, but I want to try to spell it out a little bit and get clearer on it. I want to answer, why does that relationship exist? So I don't just want to show that there's a relationship, I want to try to generate a little bit of insight into it. Because I think that by doing that, we can perhaps draw some practical implications from it. And also along the way, I think it'll provide some insight into thelema itself. So here's how I plan to go about doing that. First, I want to see how thelema relates to art and vice versa. I want to look at thelema as an artistic form of spirituality and as a spiritual art. I want to take a look at the place of creativity in thelemic theology. So that's probably going to be the headiest, sort of most philosophical part of this, but I think there's a pretty strong payoff from doing that kind of deep dive. I want to look at the relationship between art and some other branches of magic. Particularly, I'm going to look at alchemy and initiation. And finally, I want to use all of that information to think about ways we can use the power of beauty to transform our lives, to make our magic more effective. Magic both in the narrow sense of ritual, but also magic in the broader sense as what Crowley calls the art of living. So first, let's think about thelema as a spiritual art and as an artistic form of spirituality. One of the things that everyone knows, and one of the things that you encounter when you start to look at any introductory text on thelema, but a point which I think gets passed over too quickly, is the fact that its founder, Edward Alexander Crowley, was himself an artist. Art was a huge part of Crowley's life. Crowley became a painter somewhat later in life. I think he was about 39 or 40 when he started to paint, but he was a prolific poet all his life. Self-expression was an enormous part of Crowley's personality, a huge part of his being. It was something that he produced poetry pretty much like a machine. He was just constantly doing it. And I don't think that it's an accident that thelema was founded and formulated by someone who was a compulsive artist. And I think that the way that that happened, or let me say that I think that's closely tied up with the specific spiritual character that thelema has, but I think it also impacts why it is that so many artists and so many creative types are drawn to thelema. After Crowley's death, or even during Crowley's time, we see artists were drawn to thelema. Here we have Austin Osman Spare living deliciously, as he often did. Austin Osman Spare was attracted enough to join the AA briefly. He wasn't in it for a very long period of time, but obviously saw something in it that he thought was compelling. Here we have a painting by one of Crowley's students, Frater Harris. She is, of course, famous for having done the art on Crowley's 5th deck.
It's got the alpha and the omega there.
Yes, it does. We were talking about that last night. Here you have one of her drawings for the full card. We'll look at this. We'll look at this in a little more detail later. And as the 20th century progresses, and after Crowley's death, we see Thelemic ideas being transmitted by means of art. So, for example, here's a painting by Marjorie Cameron, who was, she learned magic from Jack Parsons, who indirectly was a student of Crowley's. Here we have another one of her paintings, I believe that says Adonai Ha'aretz down there. As the 20th century progresses, we see art becoming a powerful vehicle of the expression of occult ideas in general. Here we see a painting by Harry Smith, who was an artist and a Thelemite. Here we see his painting of the Tree of Life. Of course, you're probably familiar with this illustration adorning the cover of the Holy Books of Thelema. That's also Harry Smith.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know it either. Film became an extremely important medium for the transmission of occult ideas and Thelemic ideas. Here we see a still from inauguration of the Pleasure Dome by Kenneth Anger. That's Marjorie Cameron there on the left. One of his later films, Lucifer Rising. These are a couple of stills from an experimental film by Harry Smith. The late 60s were really a turning point in terms of the impact of occultism on pop culture. So here we have the cover of Sgt. Pepper, and you can see Crowley's image in the upper left-hand corner. This was really an important time for the transmission of occultism generally, because this is around the time that occultism starts to make its way into horror movies. So you have Rosemary's Baby around this time, and then this is followed by a whole slew of movies throughout the 70s that have occult themes in general. Thelema was really no exception. This is a very small selection of the bands who have been influenced by Crowley or occultism and have included those themes in their music. If you or any of your friends know about Crowley, odds are far more likely that you were introduced to Crowley through one of these bands or through an artist or through a horror film than being introduced to Crowley through an occult order. Occult orders were not as instrumental in bringing these ideas to people as artists were. We see that early on, this idea of genius is very important to Crowley and to his system of spiritual attainment. Here we have a short passage from Liber Abba, Part 1, where Crowley is talking about the idea of genius. And he has this little mock dialogue here. Question: what is genius and how is it produced? Answer: let us take several specimens of the species and try to find some one thing common to all which is not found in any other species. Question: is there any such thing? Answer: yes. All geniuses have the habit of concentration of thought and usually need long periods of solitude to acquire this habit. In particular, the greatest religious geniuses have all retired from the world at one time or another in their lives and begun to preach immediately on their return. And then a few paragraphs later he says, we have dealt in this preliminary sketch only with examples of religious genius. Other kinds are subject to the same remarks, but the limits of our space forbid discussion of these. So I think this is important because, one, it shows that the idea of genius or sort of, let's say, expressive creativity was really at the heart of Crowley's own spiritual concerns. It's also important because the type of genius that he's interested in is actually quite general and in some ways unspecified. In the context of Liber Abba, he's talking about what he calls religious genius, which are characters like Mohammed or Buddha, for instance, or Aleister Crowley, as the case may be. but he also allows that the type of genius we're talking about, which we're trying to discover and unlock, is in some respects an unknown land, a terra incognita, and it is up to you to discover for yourself, not invent, but to discover what that is and to remove the obstacles for it. It's a large part of what Thelema is about. This is from a panel discussion a few years ago that Bill Breeze attended, and he had this little snippet, this little quote which I pulled out. He says, in the introduction to his own early diaries, Crowley has a note which says, at later stages, when one gets truly advanced with this, it becomes all about vision. At the Adeptus Minor Holy Guardian Angel level, the work involves changes in your vision. You see that with these artists who have attained. Their color sense is different. Their way of seeing changed permanently. We're going to return to this idea of vision in a moment. What I just want to call out is that there, at least as far as Bill Breeze is concerned, there seems to be a necessary relationship between a kind of creative vision and spiritual attainment that comes out of Crowley's spiritual system or his spiritual teachings. This is actually the artist Bill Breeze was just talking about, Jules Solar, who was an Argentinian painter who obviously painted with pretty intense occult themes. You can see some of them here. And also very strong, provocative use of color. Now, whether you think that Jules Solar or anyone could paint this without going through magical training is another story, but the point is that this sort of visionary work or this visionary capability was important to Crowley. And he did see a certain connection between the two things. This is a painting by J.F.C. Fuller, one of Crowley's students. This one depicts the building of the temple in the Neophyte ritual. I'm not sharing this because I think that this is an example of great genius in painting by any means. It's an interesting painting. J.F.C. Fuller is not particularly known as a painter. What J.F.C. Fuller is known for by history is for having invented Blitzkrieg, which the Nazis used to overrun Poland and then France. I point this out only to, again, highlight the general character of genius that we're dealing with. We're not just dealing with religious genius. We're not just dealing with artistic genius. Genius is a general term, and it is a capability which, again, you discover it. You don't get to invent it. And also, as should be clear from this, genius is, in a certain sense, beyond good and evil. There's no moral prescriptions that one can lay over it. It could be creative or it could be destructive. That being said, we're mostly going to deal with artistic genius today. So I mentioned before about the different stages of visionary work. This is generally how one might conceive of the development of one's ability in terms of expressing themselves with an artistic medium, but also, as I see it, in terms of magical visionary work. So the first stage of this for most people is going to be something like experimentation. So for example, let's just say that you're learning how to play guitar. You pick up the guitar, you press your fingers on some things, and you hit some strings, and it probably sounds horrible, and maybe you learn to place your fingers for some open chords, and you struggle to get the rhythm right. We've all probably tried our hand at a musical instrument at one point or another. Now, if you continue to develop your skill at it, you will probably reach this middle stage of personal expression, which is a point where you can use the instrument to basically express an idea. In fact, if you get really good, you might hear a tune in your head and be able to sit down and strum it out and sing it and externalize what was inside your head and put it out there for other people to see and to experience as well. What's important about this middle stage, though, is that it largely has personal significance. Other people might appreciate what you're doing at that point. It's probably more because they like you and are your friend than that the music is necessarily good. They see it as you sharing something of yourself, and they might be interested in what you're doing insofar as they care about you. That's very common. Now, certain people might be able to occasionally achieve this third stage, which I would call universal significance. And that's where you are creating something which is not only important to you, but which seems to express something beyond that to a point where a broader audience is interested in it. And if the audience is broad enough, then you might create something which is part of, let's say, the history of music, or the history of rock music, or the history of orchestral music, or whatever it is. And this might not be a permanent stage that one lands at. You might have, create one thing by chance that just happens to strike a chord, let's say. And there's really no distinction between these two stages in terms of competence to play an instrument, right? You could have the highest level of competence, but still remain at that middle stage. There's something about hitting this level which can't precisely be taught. In fact, we're a little bit in awe of how people hit that stage. It's a little bit of a mystery, because it's not just simply a level of skill, it's something else. Now, as it turns out, visionary work in magic tends to follow a very similar trajectory. When I say visionary work in magic, I mean things like scrying, or mixing of like path working and scrying. So, for example, you do your invocation, or you open your temple, you do the invocation, and you sit there and you close your eyes and just see for the visions to come. It's a very common way to do scrying. In the beginning, you'll either see nothing, or you might start to see like sort of random, religious images. It's like there's a pyramid, and like I see an angel, and you just write these things down, and they seem really important because they have this general sort of religious quality to them. But really, you're just experimenting, and there's really very little to tell the difference between just making something up or something coming to you. You just don't have the skill yet to really do it. But if you keep at it, I think a lot of people end up somewhere in this middle stage of personal expression, where the things that you're experiencing have some kind of personal significance to you that you're seeing. So, for example, you do an invocation on the path of noon, and so you have some vision that helps you personally with some quality of death, let's say, or some quality of transformation, or it helps you wherever you are in your life. And that's that's a large part of the value of magic generally, is that it helps inform us about our lives somehow. We find it useful, or at the very least pleasant or interesting. Now, once in a while, you might end up in this third stage of universal significance. At this stage, you're having visions that they're not so much about you. They have more of a transpersonal quality to them. They have more of like an extreme visionary quality. Or are any of you do any of you have like really vivid dreams? So some like an extremely vivid dream can be like this, where maybe you're not even a participant in what's going on. You're just kind of like watching a thing unfold. Crowley's The Vision and the Voice is just full of stuff like that. That's what The Vision and the Voice is, and it's like this general apocalyptic character to it. Also, if you're familiar with Carl Jung's Red Book, the Red Book would fall under this category that I'm talking about. And the Red Book was really sort of the foundation, or the fount from which he developed his theory of psychology. But that's more of the transpersonal and transsubjective level. And again, it might be something that happens once in a while. It doesn't, you sort of spike up into it and then fall back down. So I'm marking this out, or flagging this, just because you can see that there is a quality to magical work which does seem to have something similar to working with a medium or artistic expression to it. And then there's a point in both where it seems to tip over into something else, where it goes beyond personal expression and it's expressing some kind of more general or abstract force having to do with humanity. All right, so here's what we've looked at so far. We're seeing that creativity, particularly artistic creativity, is an important part of Thelema. Genius was a concern of Crowley's. In fact, we might even say it was his primary concern in terms of what to lead people to. We've seen that art and music have been the natural vehicles of Thelemic ideas and occultism in general since the middle of the 20th century. These have been, I don't know how to put this. Well, like I was saying before, if you or your friends or anyone you know found out about Crowley or knew the name Aleister Crowley, it probably wasn't through like a Thelemic organization. It wasn't from, because like, oh, well, you know, they went to OTO and found out about Crowley. That's not how it works. For some reason, it's been very natural for these ideas to make their way into the mainstream by means of art. And so then the questions are, well, why? What are the practical implications of this? In order to answer the why question, I want to take a deeper dive on what Thelema is at a slightly more abstract level. Because I think the reason that creativity is so closely tied in with Thelema, and the reason that Thelema seems so conducive to being transmitted via art, has to do with the theology of Thelema. And the type of theology that Thelema is, I would categorize as a form of Hermeticism, which I'm going to call the theology of Thelema. Really, a more precise way to say this is that Thelemic theology is a type of Hermeticism. So what is Hermeticism? This is actually a really difficult question to answer precisely what it is. I'm not going to give a definition of Hermeticism which is precise from like a historical point of view. So like if Wouter Hanegraaff were in here, like he would probably, you know, roll his eyes at me or something else or storm out. I don't know. It's not going to meet that criteria exactly. Although it is going to have enough points of continuity with what Hermeticism was historically that it'll make sense to use the term. What I want to do instead is provide sort of an ideal picture of what Hermeticism is, something much more abstract, because I think it's going to help us frame the question better and have some insights. So, generally speaking, Hermeticism was a Renaissance movement that grew out of interest in the writings of this figure called Hermes Trismegistus. These writings came into Italy after the fall of Constantinople, and it was an interesting time intellectually in Italy because Kabbalah was also coming from Spain because the Jews had just been kicked out. So this is around the year 1500 or so. Hermeticism is not necessarily magical. There are Hermetic figures that had no interest in the occult or magic, like Lazzarelli or Ficino. But because of the historical circumstances, it tends to get tied in, or is at least a close neighbor with Kabbalah, alchemy, perennialism, what's called Prisca Philosophia, which is the idea that there is a singular theology that underlies all the different world religions, followers of Ramon Lull, Paracelsianism, Rosicrucianism, Masonry, Eckhартian mysticism, correspondences, systems of symbolism, vitalism, sympathies. These are all the sort of close neighbors of Hermeticism, and a lot of the figures historically that were interested in Hermeticism tended to be interested in these. And sure enough, we tend to see a lot of these things lumped together in, you know, alternative religious thought from the end of the 19th century up until today. I'm going to dispense with most of that. I'm just pointing it out as historical interest. Instead, I'm going to try to look at Hermeticism as a theology which cuts a middle path between what I'm considering two extremes. On the one hand, what I'm going to call Judeo-Christian theology, and on the other hand, what I'm going to call pantheism. So here is an idealized version of what I'm calling traditional Judeo-Christian theology. On the left side of the diagram here, you have God, which is a self-caused, necessarily existing, disembodied personality. That is what people mean by God generally. If you are a Christian, that is, you picture something like that when you think of God. And then on the right, you have the spatio-temporal universe that we know. And then the question is, well, and we know that God created the universe. Why? Because Genesis tells us that. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But then the question is, why? Why did God choose to create anything? You have a bit of a problem. So if you start with a being which is self-caused and necessarily existing, you're talking about something that's not dependent upon anything outside of itself. It has no need of anything. It's got everything that it needs in it. So then what would prompt such a being to create something outside of itself? Certainly no internal prompting or no sort of internal need, not because of a lack. So this tended to puzzle Christians throughout the ages, and sort of the common answer to this question is that God created out of an overabundance of love. God is just so full of love that the love just sort of brims over out of him and spills out onto the floor and hoards this somehow. And that answer was never satisfying to really anyone. It really didn't. It doesn't seem to answer anything. It seems to throw it back on something, first of all, that we don't have any insight into. Like love is a feeling. And so we're trying to have some insight into why the universe exists. And it's like, well, because God felt a certain way a lot. And that's why we're here. And it was just never really satisfying to anyone. And in fact, all the way down through the ages, you continually have philosophers asking this question of, well, why is there anything rather than nothing? In fact, I remember even as a 5-year-old, like, hanging out with my dad and watching TV, and like, I guess whatever we were watching must have been really boring, because I stopped and I turned to him and I was like, Dad, how are we here? And my father said, because of God, son. And I thought, well, that's really even more confusing than the question itself. That doesn't really answer anything. And so, if even a 5-year-old could be puzzled by this, if a 5-year-old could think of the question, and a 5-year-old could be that dissatisfied by the answer, well, of course it puzzled all the philosophers. So, the problem with this view is that there's a gap here. We have a nice concept of God, but we can't make the link from where we are to where God is, or vice versa. Now, this is an abstract presentation of what I'm calling pantheistic theology. In the pantheistic theology, again you have God. God is this circle. It's self-caused, it's necessarily existing, it's eternal, but now we're just going to say that this is also the universe. This is the spatio-temporal universe that we exist in. So what we have here, and probably the most famous proponent of this framework is the philosopher Spinoza, writing in the 17th century. And he worked this out in a book called The Ethics. And in The Ethics, he argued that there is only one substance possible. It exists necessarily. It's eternal. But since we're surrounded by substance, since we are here, that substance must be what we're experiencing now. This is it, basically. And so, from the point of view of the universe, that's cool, because the universe now exists necessarily. You don't have to ask that question anymore. Why is there anything rather than nothing? It has to be. But the problem is that now God has no personality. There can't be personality anymore, because God is pretty much just a system of causes and effects. And people were dissatisfied by this, because now it just seemed like there was no spiritual transcendence anymore. So they were both dissatisfying. And so what I'm calling Hermeticism is going to be the middle position. In Hermeticism, God both transcends the world and is part of it. So With the pantheists, a hermeticist will say that the universe is the body of God. But they're going to say that's not all that God is. Just like if I cut off your left hand, it doesn't get rid of you, right? Your hand is just part of you. It's not the entirety of you. You don't reduce to your body exactly. We say that there are parts that are transcendent. So that's how God is going to function in this system. God is distinct from the world, but needs to create the world in order to complete him or herself. There may be some necessity now. This renders creation both necessary and rational. Necessary, well, because God needs it. If God needs it, well, damn it, it had better be there. Rational, because now we can have some insight into it as well. You can think about what God is like and then have some insight into why we're here. It's not going to just be based on throwing it back on something like love or another feeling. So I'm throwing this diagram in here. I promised that this talk was not going to involve a lot of Kabbalah, and it doesn't. I'm throwing this in here because this is actually an illustration of the concept that I just mentioned. In Kabbalah, you have a completely transcendent aspect of God, which is called Ein, or Ein, however you pronounce it. A-I-N, up here. It's nothing. So, imagine no universe, no matter, no space, no time, no thought, no consciousness, nothing. That's God in the highest aspect here. But, as it turns out, nothing is really the same thing as being, or immediately becomes being, which is represented up here at Keter, which is a kind of unity of being, or a oneness of being. But as it turns out, oneness is sort of shaky and unstable. It doesn't subsist on its own. And so it immediately breaks apart into this duality of Chokmah, which is +1, and Binah, which is -1. And then that's not quite satisfactory, so it kind of spits out through these other spheres here until you end up down here, which is Malkuth, or the kingdom. And Malkuth is the universe, is the material world. It's the universe we're in right now, right at this moment. And as it turns out, in the system of mysticism, Kabbalah, Malkuth is also the eye of God. Eye with like a capital I, not like eyeball. So, in other words, God achieves fulfillment not here or here, but here. So this is an example of what I'm calling a hermetic theology or hermetic framework. Completely transcendent aspect, which has to turn over into something, into appearance, and become something. So I have a few quotes here from the Corpus Hermeticum to illustrate the concepts I'm talking about. So if thou forcest me somewhat too bold to speak, his being is conceiving of all things and making them. And as without its maker it is impossible that anything should be, so ever is he not unless he ever makes. All things in heaven and air, in earth and deep, in all of cosmos, in every part that is and that is not of everything. For there is not in all the world that is not he. He is himself, both things that are and things that are not. The things that are he hath made manifest. He keepeth things that are not in himself. So ever is he not unless he ever makes. The identity of this God is tied up with the act of creation. To get a sense of what this is like, I mean, maybe you are an artistic person, or maybe you know someone who is artistic. For someone who is really creative, an artist, they must, like, making is a compulsion. It's almost not really optional. And when they're not creating, when those creative juices aren't flowing, it can feel as though life like everything has been sort of sucked out of life. Like life is not really worth having or worth living. Like one isn't really existing fully. And when they are making, it's not special usually. It's like a baseline sort of thing. To create is normal. People who aren't artists look at that and they're kind of, they're in amazement, like, oh, the passion, the creativity. But from the perspective of the artist, it's actually more like a normal thing. It's like breathing. So if you have some conception of that, that is sort of the microcosmic version of what the God of this universe is like. This God is a compulsive creator. God's activity is will, and his essence is to will all things to be. So the very essence or the very identity of God is doing. God is not aloof. God is not just hanging out, waiting for the day to, when he's going to have a chance to write a novel. God's doing it. Insofar as God is, God's doing it. For the two are all there is, what comes to be and what makes it. And it is impossible to separate one from the other. No maker can exist without something that comes to be. Each of the two is just what it is. Therefore, one is not to be parted from the other, nor from itself. So why does the universe exist? Because God exists and God has to make. So we can see that in the Hermetic theology, God requires creation in order to be God. The highest metaphysical principle in the Hermetic universe is a God who is a creative artist or who is like a creative artist. As it turns out, the individual human being is important in this universe. For God does not ignore mankind. On the contrary, he recognizes him fully and wishes to be recognized. For mankind, this is the only deliverance, the knowledge of God. It is ascent to Olympus. So, part about wanting to know God is not special. It's not unique to Hermeticism. You find that in plenty of spiritual traditions. But God wants to be recognized. Now that's an interesting idea. You don't see that in other traditions. Who is more visible than God? This is why he made all things, so that through them all you might look on him. Again, think about an actual artist and the reasons that they create. Part of that reason is to really kind of just work out the creative compulsion for itself, because creating itself is pleasurable. But for a lot of artists, they also create because they want other people to appreciate what they've created, or it's important to them that it be recognized. God is also in that position in this universe. So we see that the individual can know God. This is not in and of itself that special, but the individual's knowledge of God is necessary for God's self-completion. By creating the universe, God gains the individual's recognition. That part, as far as I can tell, is unique to the Hermetic tradition. The individual desires to know God, but God desires to be known. She or he wishes to recognize him or herself in their creation. So, I'm doing the thing with the pronouns because you have to use personal pronouns when you talk about this conception of God. You can't... It's sort of common in a lot of contemporary spirituality to talk about, the universe is sending me this signal, or the universe wants me to do that, or even like you will have the force of the universe behind you if you're doing your will, and so forth. That's too abstract for this perspective. You need to have, God is actually a personality because God wants something. And the thing that God wants is to be recognized by another personality. So there have to be two personalities there. So you can't get away with just talking about the universe or about like force or energy or something. And the cosmos is created so that God can know him or herself. But wait, you ask. I thought there is no God but man. What's all this God talk? We're supposed to be Thelemites. This is about the human perspective. It's about fulfilling your will. What does all of this talk about God have to do with Thelema in our spiritual tradition? Isn't Thelema a kind of atheism? Well, in some respects, yes, Thelema probably is a kind of atheism, or we should say that there's an atheistic dimension to Thelema. At least from a practical level, it's less important that you believe in God rather than that you discover and express your own true will. That's really the function of Thelema. Yes, it is true that there is no God but man, but that's not the end of the story. Because we also find out from the book of the law that every man and every woman is a star. Now, different individuals have different interpretations of what this passage of the book of the law means. And I'm not going to tell anyone what to think that this passage from the book of the law means. However, I do want to look at what Crowley thinks this means. So what does it mean to be a star? Every man and every woman is a star. That is an aggregate of experiences constantly changing with each fresh event, which affects him or her either consciously or subconsciously. Well, that doesn't sound very sexy at all. But it is very interesting. So, generally when we think about who we are, like think about who you are right at this moment. You're an individual sitting in a chair, in a temple, listening to a talk, and you're surrounded by these things in the room, and you probably have a pretty comfortable sense of who you are. But according to Crowley, you're in fact not really that. Not in your essence. Your essence is actually this change, this aggregate of experiences. So an aggregate is basically when you take a bunch of things and you kind of lump them together into one thing. Well, how many things are we talking about pulling together here when we talk about the star? How big do you want to make it, right? Well, if you're thinking about the aggregate of experiences of your whole lifetime, then it has to include not just now, but pretty much everything that happened in the past, at least since your birth, maybe before, right? Everything that's going to happen to you in the future that you don't even know about yet, which is kind of weird. And then all the things that you weren't even conscious of that are also falling under this heading. And since we're talking about changes, and since changes don't happen in a vacuum, possibly also all the causes that fed into those changes, and maybe even some of the downstream effects that went from them. So it might make sense to talk first of all about the star as something like your totality of being across time, spread out across your whole life. But it also might equally make sense to include anything in the observable universe that you could, at least in theory, come across or that fed into you causally. There's really no limit. There's no precise limit in this theory about where the star ends. All we know is that it is in some sense focused on a point, which is called hadith, basically, which is the point of view. So in this concept of star, which Crowley considers to be who you really are, so we have the concept of self, we have the concept of totality, we have the concept of universe. From the other quote, we have the concept of God. So self, universe, and God, all together in this concept of star. If you're familiar at all with the thought of Carl Jung's concept of the self is very similar to this. Jung tended to self with a capital S. He tended to think of as being either identical with God or very closely related to what we mean by God. So very similar overlap here with Jung. So, all right, if the star is, if who you really are is, let's say, the entire universe or the universe, anything that could be for you, why doesn't it look that way? Why does it look as though you're sitting in a room right now and you have this more restricted notion of yourself? And furthermore, if existence is pure joy, why doesn't it always appear joyful all the time, for that matter? In fact, it often seems like the opposite, right? So how does that happen? Well, Crowley has a theory about this. He says, to know itself, each such star or soul must eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, by accepting labor and pain as its portion and death as its doom. That is, it must reveal its nature to itself by formulating that nature as duality. Well, this is just a strange passage. I mean, we've got the Garden of Eden and eating from the tree and labor and pain and death and doom. I mean, what's going on here? So, I think what he's pointing to is that, yes, yourself is this totality, but considered as a totality, yourself doesn't have any awareness of itself. And so, naturally, the self wants to know itself. God wants to know itself in this system, and so it reflects. Well, let me back up a second. If this star is going to know anything at all, it doesn't have too many options. It can't look at something outside of itself because it's everything. It's all. Its only option is to reflect. But to reflect means that it has to artificially create a subject and an object. And I say artificially because it is artificial. And it's only temporary. So, right now in your experience, there's overwhelming complexity going on right now in your experience. In order for you to have any normal seeming experience of it all, you have to simplify a lot of stuff. There has to be a lot of reduction of information. And part of that reduction has to do with what you consider to be yourself. There's other forms of reduction, like theoretically this room could just blow up or burst into flame, or an army could come through that door and start killing people, or any number of things could happen, right? If you start to think about all the bad things that could happen, you'll go fucking crazy, right? So we simplify. Part of that simplification is to say, okay, this is really complicated, but we're going to say that myself sort of starts and ends here. So, okay, you're there, I'm here. But it's temporary because, if you get lost in thought or if your mind trails off, your sense of self will be quite disconnected from your body. It'll be somewhere else, wrapped up with other things. Now, why all this business about labor and pain as its portion? Well, as soon as you introduce self-consciousness, you introduce a whole lot of problems. Pretty much right away, without delay. Life is full of all sorts of unpleasant things, like pain and disappointment and frustration and loss and sickness, and there's almost no end to it. But what tends to be really challenging within experience is not so much those particular events or those particular sensations or stimuli, but rather the knowledge that there is a person, namely me, who is undergoing those things. So, not only have I come down with a cold, for instance, I know that I am the person who has come down with a cold. And that's just not fair. I don't like that. And so, it's that second order reflection that introduces this narrative about this little character called the self moving around through the world, and that introduces this other level of suffering and also of shame. You can't be ashamed if you can't have that reflection on yourself. So, when Adam and Eve eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, what's the first thing that happens? As soon as they do it,
God says no.
It's literally in the line right after they bite into the fruit. They discover their nakedness. They feel shame. They feel embarrassed and cover up. The story is about the first thing that is attendant upon self-consciousness. Now, as it turns out, it's actually a lot worse than that. That's not even the worst part of it. Because if I can look at myself, and if I can know that I am vulnerable in these ways, I know I can die. I know I can get sick. I know something bad could happen to me. And if I look at you, and I'm seeing that you're a person who is like me, I can probably reasonably infer that you're vulnerable in the same way that I am. Which means I could make a lot of trouble for you, right? I could fuck with you pretty hard. Like animals, like in the animal kingdom, like animals will just tear each other apart and rip each other's heads off, and it's. But they don't sit down and plan how to torment someone, or they don't. I guess cats will play with a mouse or something before eating it, but
they're devious.
They're devious, but it's not like malice is something that's especially human. So not only do you have a recognition of this world, which is just really hard to live in by anybody's standard, you can add on to that, the sizable minority of people who are just evil, or who are just out to do harm to do other people. The way the world is set up isn't enough for them. They want to find some ways to add to it. And it's just people have noticed it for a really long time. And he saes, that is, it must reveal its nature to itself by formulating that nature as duality. So the star is in the same position as the Hermetic God that I was talking about a moment ago. It wants to know itself, and in order to do that, it has to involve itself in creating a world. But since the star can't create anything outside of itself, all it can do is separate off part of itself and say, that's the world. But upon looking at itself, but upon creating that world, it doesn't find divinity. It doesn't find being, consciousness, and bliss. Instead, it finds impermanence, not self, and suffering, the three opposite characteristics. So it involved itself in a bigger problem now that it has to solve. As it turns out, pretty much all of the world's spiritualities, well, let me say that most of the major religions we're aware of that have come about since the Iron Age, they somewhat define themselves, or can be defined, in terms of how they address this particular problem. Crowley, of course, has his own answer to this. In fact, this particular issue is addressed in symbolic form in the Minerva liturgy of OTO. It's done through symbols, but it's the same issue. It's probably not giving anything away if I said that the answer has something to do with finding and doing your true will. That's probably not giving away a state secret. But here's another way that he chooses to express it. This is just the sentence immediately after. It must express itself by a series of symbolic gestures, ostensibly external to it. Just as a painter reveals one facet of his delight diamond by covering a canvas with colors in such a way that the picture seems at first sight to represent something outside himself. It must in fact repeat for itself the original magic of Nebty and Hadith which created it. The universe may appear to be something which is opposed to me, and on particularly bad days, existence might feel like a curse. But your job as a Thelemic is to figure out another way of seeing things. You have to figure out how to see the universe around you not as something which is being imposed upon you, but rather as a medium of expression. Something akin to how an artist uses an artistic medium. And this process has something to do with love. We know that because Nebty and Hadith are mentioned here. This is a passage from Liber Samic, which expresses a very similar idea, but just in somewhat different terms. All experiences contribute to make us complete in ourselves. We feel ourselves subject to them so long as we fail to recognize this. When we do, we perceive that they are subject to us. And whenever we strive to evade an experience, whatever it may be, we thereby do wrong to ourselves. We thwart our own tendencies. To live is to change, and to oppose change is to revolt against the law which we have enacted to govern our lives. To resent destiny is thus to abdicate our sovereignty and to invoke death. Indeed, we have decreed the doom of death for every breach of the law of life, and every failure to incorporate any impression starves that particular faculty which stood in need of it. So the answer to the problem of alienation, which arises with the star dividing itself, is to paradoxically move further into that experience. There are different ways that you could think of dealing with the phenomenon of self-consciousness. You have choices with regard to it. I mean, one option would just be simply to reject self-consciousness. And you would think, well, wait, how would you do that? That doesn't even seem possible. But of course it's possible to reject self-consciousness. There are tons of ways to do that. You could use drugs and alcohol to obliterate it. You could try to sleep as much as you can to not deal with it. You can throw yourself into work to not have to ever deal with it. You can throw yourself into a relationship to never have to. There's so many ways that you can avoid self-consciousness. There's so many ways to avoid experience. You can put up all kinds of walls around you. Humans are great at this. But in Thelema, the medicine is also the poison. You're to go further into it. You're actually to expand what it is that you will allow yourself to experience. Or another way to think about it is you will do your will, and whatever consequences arise from it, you will affirm those. You will begin to treat the universe as though you yourself chose it and are responsible for everything in it. As long as you're doing your will, any consequence that comes from it, you're owning up to it. We'll return to this idea a little bit later, but you can also think of Crowley's statement in Duty that you are to make yourself the center of your own universe. It doesn't mean just constantly, looking at yourself in the mirror and saying, me. It means radical responsibility. Taking what comes with that and never allowing yourself to be bitter about it. But we find this idea of artistic expression right there at the center of it. Oh, this is cool. The formula of this card is then the complete appreciation of all existing things. He rejoices in the rugged and the barren, no less than the smooth and the fertile. All things equally exalt him. He represents the finding of ecstasy in every phenomenon, however naturally repugnant. He transcends all limitations. He is Pan. He is all. So when I say salvation in Thelema, don't get too hung up on that. This is one version of it. This is the version that one might profitably attribute to the path of Ayin. There's a more mystical path which we could attribute to Nu if we wanted to. But this is one version of it. The descent of spirit into matter is something like an artistic process. That's what we're going to explore shortly. I just stole my own thunder. Okay, here we go. Summary so far. Well, we've seen that, I hope we see that Thelema assumes a hermetic theology in which God relates to the universe as an artist relates to a work of art. In other words, I'm suggesting to you that one way to think about this particular path of salvation is to take an artist's mentality toward the universe. It's interesting that aesthetic appreciation involves a certain level of detachment as well. And detachment is also a particularly important part of Thelema. We are to enjoy everything equally, but we're also to maintain a certain level of indifference about it. This introduces an ineluctable, sensuous dimension to gnosis. So, I didn't mention this before, but there's a distinction to be made between what we're looking at here and what you might know under the heading of Gnosticism. This gets confusing because we have a ritual called the Gnostic Mass, but gnosis in that case means something like direct, unmediated relationship with divinity. That's the sense of gnosis meant there. Ancient Gnosticism tended to treat the material universe as a cage. So there's this being, the demiurge, who is just sort of like a cosmic dickhead, who takes your soul and just imprisons it in matter. And then you have to be sort of like, the Count of Monte Cristo and try to figure out how to escape from the thing and somehow, presumably get revenge, I hope, for someone doing that to you. That's not how the universe shows up in Thelema. In universe, it's more like the palette of an artist. So we're invited to do something, we're invited to move into it, not try to escape it. In Thelema, the star or self is what I'm calling the Hermetic God. I'm claiming that this explains or helps explain Thelemic soteriology. Soteriology is just the study of salvation. Specifically, in this case, how to address the phenomenon of human suffering that we all know about and we're all intimately acquainted with. And I'm suggesting that success on the path requires one to see the world as an artist God would. So now I want to consider what role aesthetics and art in particular play in spiritual realization. So it's one thing to say that we should take a sort of disinterested aesthetic attitude toward everything, but I want to also think about the particular sort of subcategory of experiences that we call aesthetic appreciation or art production. Is there something special about that? What precisely is the relationship between artistry and aesthetics and Thelemic magic? So we started general, now we're going to get a little more particular and look at the magic of art itself. Let's see what's on the next slide. A really long quote. So this is a really long quote because this goes on for a few slides. At the risk of being pedantic, I'm going to read the whole thing with you guys. This is from a section of Magic and Theory and Practice on the Art of Alchemy, which is also also in the same chapter as where he's talking about the Eucharist. This is a really interesting passage because, well, I'll just read it for you. Yet beneath this diversity, we may perceive an obscure identity. Diversity he's talking about, so he's been talking up to this point about different texts on alchemy and how it's just sort of this hodgepodge of symbolism and weird processes going on and weird figures, and it's hard to make heads or tails of it. But he thinks he has found a pattern in it, which is relevant. He says, they all begin with a substance in nature which is described as existing almost everywhere and as universally esteemed of no value. So again, if you think back to how the universe appears from that perspective of the suffering self or the alienated self, that's kind of how this is turning out. The alchemist is in all cases to take this substance and subject it to a series of operations. By so doing, he obtains his product. This product, however named or described, is always a substance which represents the truth or perfection of the original first matter, and its qualities are invariably such as pertain to a living being, not to an inanimate mass. In a word, the alchemist is to take a dead thing, impure, valueless and powerless, and transform it into a live thing, active, invaluable, and thaumaturgic. The reader of this book will surely find in this a most striking analogy with what we have already said of the processes of magic. What, by our definition, is initiation? The first matter is a man, that is to say, a perishable parasite, bred to the earth's crust, crawling irritably upon it for a span, and at last returning to the dirt whence he sprang. So again, think about how the self turns up on that initial moment of reflection within the star. It doesn't find God looking in the mirror. It finds you waking up with, a hangover and, bleary-eyed on Monday and forced to go to a job that you don't want to go to and so forth. The process of initiation consists in removing his impurities and finding in his true self an immortal intelligence, to whom matter is no more than the means of manifestation. Again, the idea of the universe as a vehicle of expression. The initiate is eternally individual. He is ineffable, incorruptible, immune from everything. He possesses infinite wisdom and infinite power in himself. This equation is identical with that of a talisman. The magician takes an idea, purifies it, intensifies it by invoking into it the inspiration of his soul. It is no longer a scrawl scratched on a sheepskin, but a word of truth, imperishable, mighty to prevail throughout the sphere of its purport. So the model of making a talisman might be another way to think about what I was saying before. What if you could make your entire sensible universe or your entire life somehow into a talisman? What if you can impress your soul upon the life that you're living? What would that look like? The evocation of a spirit is precisely similar in essence. The exorcist takes dead material substances of a nature sympathetic to the being whom he intends to invoke. He banishes all impurities, therefrom prevents all interference therewith, and proceeds to give life to the subtle substance thus prepared by instilling his soul. We're almost at the summit, guys, I promise. Just a couple more. Here it is, it's coming into view. Once again, there is nothing in this exclusively magical. Rembrandt van Ryn used to take a number of ores and other crude objects. From these he banished the impurities and consecrated them to his work by the preparation of canvases, brushes, and colors. This done, he compelled them to take the stamp of his soul. From those dull, valueless creatures of earth he created a vital and powerful being of truth and beauty. It would indeed be surprising to anybody who has come to a clear comprehension of nature if there were any difference in the essence of these various formulas. The laws of nature apply equally in every possible case. So again, this is just a repetition of what we were seeing before. The analogy between initiation and artistic production has to do with creating something alive, and that has to do with imprinting the soul upon matter. we are now in a position to understand what alchemy is. We might even go further and say that even if we had never heard of it, we know what it must be. Let us emphasize the fact that the final product is in all cases a living thing. So here's a summary of what we just saw. Alchemy, talismanic magic, initiation, and art production share a similar form. We might say they're isomorphic. And they have to do with turning something which is dead matter into something which is a living being. Now, what do we mean by creating a living being? I don't think he's talking about, like, Frankenstein's monster. I don't think we're talking about, like, taking some clay and, blowing on it and, like, a frog leaps out of your hands or something like that, although that would be pretty cool. I mean, we know that from this quote, because we know that it has something more to do with something that's like an artistic process. When we think about what's involved in an artistic process, we're taking matter and we're creating something which is meaningful. We're impressing significance on something. So much so that when other people look at it, they experience a similar sense of being enlivened somehow by it. Or they also take something away from it. The great painting, or the great film, or the great piece of music is like a talisman that way. Or when it passes into somebody's hands, the blessing, or as it may be the curse, passes on to them, and they experience it as well. It has a similar power to it. It's the power of the transmission of meaning and of significance. What we're talking about here is salvation figured as something like having a life of meaning and purpose. I mentioned earlier about, we looked before a lot at the star, and the star dividing itself. We can think of the star, or we can think of the self. A symbol that's commonly used to represent that is the circle. Circles typically represent self, or totality, or the world, probably because when you go to the top of a mountain and look around, the horizon forms a big circle around you. That would be sort of a natural representation of the world as people understood it. And so that star divides, and so the self is in a certain sense kicked out of it, or it's kicked out of itself. So instead of being that circle, we're just some little speck in there, right? Crawling irritably upon the surface of the earth and scrounging around and having to collect a paycheck and sit in traffic. And so the question is, how do we get back to being divine? Or rather, the more specific question is, how do we get back to a consciousness or a self-consciousness of being divine? Because we are divine. Every man and woman is a star already. You don't have to do anything to change that basic fact. So how do you come to an awareness of it? Because you can see that there's two options here. If you wanted to go back to just being the star, all you have to do is die. That immediately ends the sense of separateness right there. And the soul, or whatever you want to think of it, returns to bliss. But there's no self-consciousness in it. The whole point of dividing was so that the star could know itself as divine. Right now, you know yourself. You just don't know yourself under the correct description, let's say. The symbol for let's say, knowledge or consciousness would be something like the cross. That's a typical representation of consciousness. So what we're talking about is, in some sense, moving the cross into the center of the circle and getting ourselves into the center of the cross. That's the symbol of the self-consciousness of the star as a star, right here and now in this life, as part of your biography, let's say, somehow. So that's the second, more developed way. This is the way to do it as an individual. If you die, you're not an individual anymore. Your individuality is gone. So the question is, how do you manifest it here in this life? And of course, you recognize this. This is also the symbol of the sun. The sun is the house on the tree of life. Tifereth is the house on the tree of life where this marriage takes place between the cross and the serpent. Tifereth means beauty. There's a connection here with beauty. This gets us into much deeper mysteries than I want to go into. But I want to show you that these central mysteries here, this is the mystery of microprosopis, or of the divine individual, it's sitting right next to these issues of art and beauty. They're that important. In every man there is a child that yearns to play. And the most attractive game is occultation, mystery. Man's maturity, to have regained the seriousness that he had as a child at play. One of the things that happens with the splitting of the star, let's forget about theology for a second. Let's forget about the abstract stuff. And let's just think about it from a psychological perspective, from an individual perspective. We all start when we're very young, in a certain sense, without a very strong sense of self. Our sense of self is very dispersed. We tend to be at one with things. Right? Like a little child, like when something upsets a little child, it's like earth-shattering. They flip the fuck out and scream as loud as they can. Just like when a little child is like happy and excited, it's just like their face just like, they're so overcome with joy at things. They are completely at one with their experience. And there's a kind of, and that's also the same thing, that's also the root of their spontaneity. You could think of the star as like that. But as time goes on, as a person develops, as they get older, they get into more trouble and life hits up against them and defines for them where the limits of their self are. It creates that split that we're talking about within the star, where self-consciousness eventually emerges. They learn limitation, in other words. It's the same thing. If the experiences that the child gets into, let's say, are particularly traumatic, they might reflect upon themselves or be thrown back on themselves in a way that they're not at all ready for, where they don't really have the resources within them to sort of cope with the situation. And the human spirit has this sort of, innate genius to it where it'll cope. And so these various defense mechanisms or walls will come up. And so what starts out in childhood as a kind of innate, ingenious form of self-protection and adaptation, as the person gets older and older, it becomes severe dysfunction after a while. And all sorts of problems arise. And then, that's how it all ends up in psychotherapy and so forth. But what you end up with is various walls around you, in a very rigid sense of, this is me, this is the border of where I am, and that's the rest of the world. And an inability to cope with that constant flux of change, which is really going on underneath. With the result that we can end up feeling quite dead and unnourished by life, because we're not able to trust enough to create the openings to let that vitality come in and to begin to enliven us and let us feel that spontaneity. But one of the cool things about art is that it's a safe way to experience that energy coming in. So you see a particularly vibrant painting, or listening to really intense music at a rock concert where you're just surrounded by all this sensation, and that energy is allowed to sort of break through those walls, and so there's this feeling of existence and a feeling of being alive. Oneself is becoming alive and seeing something which is alive, and to the point where the next day it might feel like you have like almost a severe hangover just from how much sensation you experienced and how you're not used to experiencing it. So the question here is, how do you return to that sense of spontaneity that you had as a child that you lost through these bad experiences? I say child broadly, it could apply to adolescence as well. You can't just simply walk right back into it and go directly into it. It just doesn't work that way. It's not life. How do you do it as an adult? Well, there's very little difference between a wise person and a fool, at least in how we tend to conceive of them. There's really only one exception to it. The wise person returns to the things of childhood, but with their eyes open, with a greater sense of capability. They're not naive anymore. They know what things are dangerous, but they're able to approach them anyway. They're able to muster the courage to have the trust necessary to approach reality with their eyes open. When we view art, we're getting some kind of sense of that. It's awakening that sense of spontaneity again within us, which we could enjoy more if we could have the courage and build up the trust and have the wisdom. In each poetic statement, chaos must shimmer through the veil of regular order. It's talking about poetry, but it's a similar thing. It's a window into something beyond these artificial walls that we've created around us, either through trauma or even just the normal process of growing up and coming across the old person to the job. Truth lives on in the illusion of art, and it is from this copy or after image that the original image will once again be restored. The after image of what? Well, you're seeing the after image of that initial connection that you once had, that sense of spontaneity, of aliveness that you've lost. And when it shows up in a particularly poignant way, it feels a little bit like an emergency. I mean, think of the last time, or think of one of the last times that you either finished a really good novel or maybe saw a particularly powerful film. You may have had the feeling immediately after, you may have had the thought of something like, wow, something has to change. Or something in my life has to change. But it wasn't clear what had to change. You didn't really know. Like, art is, I mean, unless it's like whatever, like a propaganda film, but like most art isn't going to tell you like, well, actually what you have to change is, you have to change X, Y, and Z. Or, you really ought to get a job, and, whatever. It's not like that. Art doesn't do that. It's really more like a feeling that it produces, not a particular like program inside your head. And there's this sense of urgency in it, but the urgency doesn't have to do with like you're gonna die or something. it's not an existential threat. Like, oh shit, an asteroid's gonna hit the Earth. I better, build a bunker or something. It's not like that. Like, death isn't really a problem in and of itself. What's really the problem that's being raised is maybe that you haven't lived as much as you should have. If you're really living, death isn't going to be that much of a problem to you. Your own death, that is. Death of other people is different. But the real problems with death arise when it doesn't seem like you have truly been living at all. When you haven't been realizing something like the potential within yourself, which is a mystery and a sort of gift that you've been given, but that you're now squandering and wasting. That's the sense of urgency that's arising. And so these particular experiences, they're not all aesthetic experiences, but the aesthetic ones are just particularly potent. It's like you're being called by something. You're being called through like a crack in the window, like of a wall that you didn't even know was there. And there's some message being sent, something's flickering, and you have to go toward it. You're being called. What are you being called toward? Well, I don't know, but it's something like living a life of meaning and purpose. It's living a life of doing your true will. A life of risk, but where it's worth it. That's why in beauty is eternal truth revealed. It's shining through. It's a part of the star or the self lighting up and saying, hey, over here. Have you ever wondered why the rainbow is the symbol of promise in Genesis? I mean, there's probably some spooky esoteric reason for it, but what occurred to me is because it's beautiful. That's the symbol of God's promise. Beauty is something like the image of the image of, I mean, to put it in a really sort of facile way, of just a better future. A future where you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and therefore you are again at home in the world and spontaneous, but awake, eyes open. That's the difference. So we've seen that Thelema has a strong relationship with art because of the theological significance of the sensuous world. It expresses the soul of God the way a work of art expresses the soul of the artist. The Thelemite is the hermetic artist god of their own universe, but the world doesn't immediately appear as my work of art. I have to come to experience it that way. The process by means of which I do this is called magic, in particular initiation. Initiation is isomorphic with alchemy, talismanic magic, and art production. It involves the transformation of dead matter into living form. In the experience of the beautiful, I am experiencing the call of myself to live a life of meaning and purpose. This is the spiritual significance of beauty. Alive, I think, just means, the best word would just be significant. It's significant somehow. The world lights up as something more significant, something worth living. That's how it appears when you're doing your true will and you're really committed to it. That's what I was saying before, how, come what may, can you accept it and take responsibility for it? Or even if not responsibility, how about just accept it without bitterness? Beauty is something like a calling to do this. It's not the thing itself. I don't want you to mistake what I'm saying. It's more like the image of it. or the enticement to do it. Okay, so what? What do we do with that? Let's talk about the power of beauty, what we might use beauty to accomplish. Well, it's fairly straightforward. Beauty excites us to actualize our potential, to do our true wills. Also, keep in mind when I say beauty, I'm using it as sort of a catch-all for aesthetically powerful experiences. Like when you listen to Stravinsky, I mean, I guess certain parts of Stravinsky are beautiful, but the Rite of Spring is really dissonant. And that's enlivening in its own way. So don't take me to say that by beauty I mean all things that are harmonious. I mean what appeals to you on an aesthetic level, in other words. It is the image of what is possible if we were doing our wills. And therefore you can use beauty to motivate yourself. A simple way to start with doing this is to just surround yourself with art, especially where you live. It's a way of impressing your soul upon the place where you live. It's a way of actually turning your own home into a talisman, in a certain sense. It doesn't have to be like fancy or expensive. In fact, the less money that you spend on it, maybe the better. Maybe the more significant it is to you. I don't know. But just begin by surrounding yourself with things of beauty. Paintings, sculptures, anything that you want. Or if even that's too much, then just simply, again, impress your soul upon every aspect of where you live. Every space. Make everything in your domicile expressive of who you are. I wasn't going to say anything about Kabbalah, but I may as well point this out. The Magus card, the magician, what's the Hebrew letter associated with it?
House. House.
The house, yeah, exactly. Bet, the house. Magic is related to creating a domicile, creating a house, creating something like a dwelling on earth. Start there, start simple. Create a center of sacred order and beauty, and move outward. If you do magic, if you are a person who does ritual, this is an opportunity to use beauty to enhance your magic. You could start by including as many correspondences as you can from 777 into your rituals. Give a lot of attention to detail. You have colors to choose from in the 4 color scales. You have incense to choose from. You have plants and flowers. How many of you use flowers in your ritual? Flowers are awesome to use in ritual. Oh my God. Bring in colored lights. Create an immersive, sensual experience. Make the entire thing embody your intention. Don't just go through the motions. Don't just show up and be like, all right, fuck you, show up, here we are. This is an image from a ritual I did not long ago. This is actually really simple, except for this mandala, which is something that I created, and some red light. Well, and some fire. I like having a lot of fire. I like burning shit up. I actually used 12 different colored lights in this ritual. I got crazy with the colors. But yeah, just as a way of being expressive with it, of having fun with it, of bringing that playfulness and that joy into the ritual. God, like why the hell do we do magic? It's a really sort of playful form of spirituality. There are a lot of forms of spirituality where you don't have to bother with any of this shit at all. You can just sit there on your knees and pray or meditate. You don't have to bother with it. Magic involves all of it. Use it. Like, have fun. That's how I got into magic, actually. This is a picture from a 231 ritual. So we have the 231 sigil in the center here on this clay thingy. You can see the flowers in the background. This was a small group ritual that we did. So this is for a path of Koth. So we have, the fortune card there and some incense. And the violet light. So just bringing a few simple elements together makes something which is actually pretty visually compelling and really helps give you something to focus on while you're doing the invocations. This is from a fire ritual that we did. again, super simple. We got some red flowers. There's like a red covering for the candle, red altar cloth, and just like a really simple, clean aesthetic. The wine in the center was a Eucharist. This is another 231 ritual. So this thing is pretty cool. This is like a voodoo Getty flag style thing that has like little sequins on it to create the sigil, the 231 sigil. This was for the path of Mem, so it's water. This is the hanged man, and again some flowers and colored lights. What else? So we've looked at how to use magic in our own lives and our own personal practices. So starting with the place where you live, make it as beautiful as you know how. If you do magic, bring more of an aesthetic sense on it. Treat it as though you're going to try to meet somebody that you're trying to impress somehow. That's a good way to think about it. What about in our communities, though? What about like in our groups, in our group space? And how do we communicate Thelemic ideas with art and with aesthetics? This is a picture this must be from Alumbrados. So I've actually never visited Alumbrados, but they just look so amazing that I just sit there and look at their Facebook or whatever, and I'm just usually in envy. Because they're aesthetic as fuck in everything that they do. It's just like, this is their mass altar. I'm like, what the hell?
Shit.
I know, right? I know. And the amazing thing about this is like, this makes a distinct impression on me. I couldn't tell you precisely what the impression is, other than that these people, whoever made this, they're very creative and they have a very unique angle on things. They're iconoclastic. They're coming from it from outside the box. And I just, right there, listed all the things that Thelema is about. I can tell these people if I didn't know what Thelema was, I would know these folks somehow were Thelemites. This is actually from one of our rituals at Horizon, our summer ritual. Little spooky altar. That is from my spring ritual that I did last year. Again, it's a little hard to tell what's going on, but something's going on. It's ritual. And so my sort of theory about this is that this sort of stuff communicates more immediately who we are and what we're about than if you were to sit down and be like, well, actually, Thelema is a religion that was formed in 1904 by famed occultist and mountain climber Aleister Crowley, who was born in Leamington Spa. Like, it's like this gets to it like that. It's like, oh, these guys have a unique way of looking at the universe. I don't know what it's about, but it has something to do with self-expression. So we've seen that the connection between Thelema and art is particularly strong. Thelema was created by an artist. Many individuals drawn to Thelema are artists of some kind. And Thelema has made its way into the mainstream via art and music, not occult orders. The connection I have tried to explain by the theology of Thelema, which I call the type of Hermeticism, in which God is an expressive artist. The nature of God and the will to create are closely aligned. The sensuous universe is not a cage for the soul, but rather a mirror of God's true nature, in the same way a work of art is a mirror of an artist's soul. Each person is a star, or a unique hermetic creator God. The universe appears to stand over and against each one of us. In other words, we have the experience of suffering. But the way to salvation is to see every event as an expression of our own true nature. The universe is our soul's means of expressing and knowing itself. You could think of the universe as being like a mirror, but the mirror only works if you are in active relationship with it. You have to move around in it and kind of catch your reflection in it by engaging with it and taking risks, which requires courage and knowledge and will and occasionally the ability to shut your mouth. While all experiences are expressions of will and are potentially joyous, the experience of beauty has unique spiritual significance. The experience of beauty is a perception of balance between order and chaos, or between the mind and the world. In beauty, our true selves call us forth into a life of meaning and purpose. Because of the motivational power of beauty, we should seek to surround ourselves with beauty where we live. We should do beautiful rituals to create a center of sacred beauty in our lives that we can expand out from. We should create order, harmony, and stability where we live so that we may greet the chaos of the world with an internal feeling of readiness. So greet chaos outside your home. Don't wake up to it every single day. Right? We all have challenges at home. Challenges at home are cool. They help you grow. You know, a dumpster fire of a house is not cool. That's going to mess with your head. It's going to mess with your ability to do your will. Because of the motivational power of beauty, we should make our public rights as beautiful as we can, maintain group space, which is beautiful. This might be a better way to make a first impression about who we are and what we value. We can communicate our iconoclastic beliefs and values and put the principle of creativity at the front of what we do. Because that's really what Thelema is about. It's a creative form of salvation. By presenting Thelema as an artistic religion and a spiritual art, we may attract the sorts of individuals who already share our values, and we may begin to have more influence on culture outside of our lives. And of course, in none of this am I intending to say that only artists should be involved with Thelema, but that these particular creative values, which are part of Thelema, we could help ourselves by putting them up front and using them as much as possible. May your minds be open unto the light. May your hearts be centers of love. May your bodies be temples of life. Love is the law, love your will. Thank you.